Welcome to The Explainer. If you turn on the news on any given day, you're practically guaranteed to hear endless political noise about the rich getting richer, the working class feeling the squeeze, and politicians pointing fingers at each other. Well, today, we're going to completely step back from all that modern political rhetoric. Instead, we're going to look objectively at 10,000 years of human history to understand the actual cold, hard math of how wealth concentrates and, more importantly, how it has historically been distributed. Look, this isn't about assigning blame. It's a deep dive into the fascinating mechanical laws of human civilization and the specific historical forces that have shaped our economic reality for millennia. Here is the roadmap for our explainer today. We'll start with number 1, the inequality challenge. Then 2, the origins of wealth. Followed by 3, the four horsemen. After that, we'll hit 4, the Great Compression. 5, are there peaceful alternatives? And finally, 6, what the future holds. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the inequality challenge, the present reality. Before we start looking backward into history, we really need to understand exactly where we stand today regarding the concentration of resources. I want you to just consider the sheer scale of the number 62. Back in 2015, just 62 individual billionaires held as much private net wealth as the poorer half of humanity combined. That is over 3.5 billion people. I mean, think about that. If those 62 people decided to go on a field trip together, they could literally all fit comfortably into a single passenger bus, and yet their combined assets perfectly offset the resources of half the globe. It's an absolutely staggering concentration of resources. But to figure out exactly why this happens, we have to look way past the modern era. So to understand how we got here, we're grounding our explainer today in a truly remarkable piece of source material. It's a book called The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. Now, Scheidel isn't some modern political pundit pushing a partisan agenda. He's a serious historian. He's gathered thousands of years of data to trace the exact mechanisms that cause wealth to gap apart over time, and the specific forces that eventually force it back together. We're essentially looking at the laws of economic gravity across the entire human timeline. That brings us to section 2, the origins of wealth. How did we get here? How exactly did humanity move from being a mostly egalitarian species of foragers to a highly stratified global society? Well, for most of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. And in foraging societies, wealth couldn't really exist the way we think of it today. Think about it mechanically. If you hunt a massive animal, that meat is eventually going to rot, right? You can't just hoard it. Your wealth was basically your physical strength, your hunting skills, and your social relationships. But the shift to farming and herding changed absolutely everything. Once humans started domesticating plants and animals, we could suddenly accumulate physical material assets. When you grow wheat and fence in a herd of cows, you can lock it up, you can guard it, and crucially, you can pass those assets down to your kids. This simple mechanical shift, the ability to store and inherit physical wealth, is literally the root of enduring economic inequality. And as farming naturally led to the creation of states and empires, this dynamic accelerated rapidly. Just listen to this ancient Middle Babylonian proverb. The king is the one at whose side wealth walks. For almost all of human history, the 1% weren't corporate CEOs or tech founders. They were guys with swords, rulers, lords, aristocrats. They used the organized power of the state, which meant coercion and military force, to extract taxes and labor from everyday working people. The state effectively enriched a small elite at the expense of the many. So the crucial takeaway here is that massive inequality isn't some modern invention. It became a standard, stable, mechanical feature of human civilization the very moment we settled down. So if massive inequality is the default state of civilization, how has it historically been reversed? This brings us to section 3, and honestly the core, fascinating thesis of our explainer, the four horsemen. To explain how this inequality gets reversed, Scheidel borrows a famous, apocalyptic metaphor from the 15th century, the four horsemen. He uses this to introduce a really tragic historical paradox. You see, for thousands of years, human civilization simply did not lend itself to peaceful equalization. Actually, stability always naturally favored the rich, allowing capital to just compound over generations. The only things that historically broke these established wealth gaps and flattened resource distribution were massive, violent, apocalyptic shocks. Scheidel identifies 4 specific historical forces that have consistently wiped out established wealth gaps. He calls them the four horsemen of leveling. First, mass mobilization warfare. These are massive conflicts that consume entire nations, destroying physical capital and forcing governments to heavily tax the rich just to fund the war effort. Second, transformative revolution. Think radical, often bloody upheavals that entirely restructure society, usually by violently seizing assets from the wealthy. Third, state failure, or complete systems collapse. When the governing structure simply disintegrates, the legal and financial systems protecting the elite disappear, wiping out their leverage literally overnight. And fourth, lethal pandemics. Plagues so severe they fundamentally alter the economy. When a massive portion of the population dies, there is a sudden extreme labor shortage, meaning everyday workers suddenly have immense bargaining power. These are the historical forces of leveling. Let's move to Section 4 to see how this builds into what economists call the Great Compression. We're going to look at the 20th century, which is the most documented instance of these violent levelers in action. In fact, it's an era a lot of your own parents or grandparents lived through directly. Between 1914 and 1945, the globe experienced a relentless series of unprecedented shocks. We saw the outbreak of World War I, the horrific global influenza pandemic right on its heels, and then the devastating outbreak and conclusion of World War II. Now, obviously, these were terrible human tragedies, but economically speaking, these compound disasters acted as a massive reset button. These violent ruptures destroyed accumulated capital all across the globe and fundamentally reorganized the global economy, forcefully flattening the gap between the ultra-rich and the working class. But how did that actually work in practice? Well, we often think of the post-World War II era, the era of the booming American middle class, single-income families, widespread homeownership, as this peaceful economic miracle. But historically speaking, it was the direct result of massive, catastrophic violence. It wasn't just that industrial-scale warfare blew up physical assets like factories and big estates in Europe. Total war forced massive policy changes everywhere. To build tanks and fund these massive military operations, governments had to implement confiscatory taxation. Top income tax rates in the U.S. soared to over 90%. At the same time, the government heavily intervened in the economy, and the massive reliance on everyday factory workers provided the catalyst for widespread unionization. So, ironically, it was the immense violence and the absolute necessity of the world wars that effectively built the prosperous mid-century working and middle class by drastically shifting power and resources away from the top. And, the 20th century wasn't an anomaly either. We see this exact mechanical pattern across all of history. Take the Black Death in the 14th century. When a third of the workforce simply disappears, the surviving working class can suddenly turn around and demand double or triple the pay from the landlords. It's just simple supply and demand triggered by immense tragedy. When the Roman Empire collapsed, the immense fortunes of the aristocracy were wiped out completely because the state apparatus protecting them just vanished. During the communist revolutions of the 20th century, wealth was violently expropriated. Across the board, throughout all eras, immense human suffering consistently preceded economic equality. Which brings us to a very natural and pretty urgent question. Section 5, are there peaceful alternatives? Acknowledging the incredibly dark nature of this historical data, we have to ask, haven't there been any peaceful, benign ways to level the playing field without relying on war, plague, or collapse? When we objectively look for peaceful alternatives, things like land reform or passing laws to spread the wealth, the historical results are pretty sobering. Historically, without the actual threat of violence backing them up, peaceful land reforms have yielded highly inconsistent results. Macroeconomic crises, like stock market crashes, sure, they might hurt the rich temporarily, but they don't fundamentally redistribute wealth to the working class in the long run. And surprisingly, the data shows that democratization on its own, just simply giving people the right to vote, does not consistently mitigate inequality. The rich often just find new ways to maintain their economic leverage within those democratic systems. So the historical record is incredibly stark. There is simply no historical repertoire of benign, peaceful means that has ever achieved the dramatic, sweeping wealth compressions produced by the four horsemen. Throughout all of recorded history, significant lasting reductions in inequality were almost exclusively driven by massive, violent disruptions to the established order. Peaceful policy reforms just pale in comparison to the massive leveling effects of wars and plagues. Let's move to our final section and see how all of this builds to our present moment. Section 6, What the Future Holds. We are going to use this deep historical lens to view the future of wealth and inequality in our own lifetimes. The absolutely crucial point for our modern era is this. The historical levelers currently lie dormant. Since the end of World War II, we've enjoyed an era of unprecedented peace and stability, which is, of course, a wonderful thing for humanity. we have largely avoided total mass mobilization wars and total state collapse in the developed world. But because these traditional, violent levelers have been asleep, the natural economic laws of gravity of human civilization have simply taken back over. Capital naturally compounds. Without a cataclysm to break it up, the gap naturally widens. Wealth inequality has simply resumed its ancient upward march. And looking ahead, upcoming technological advances threaten to exert even more extreme upward pressure on this inequality. We have unabated globalization, which consistently favors those with massive capital. But more concerning for the everyday worker is the rise of computerization, automation, and artificial intelligence. These technologies act as the ultimate wedge. They threaten to decouple capital from labor entirely. Think about it. In the past, the elite still needed a large working class to run the factories and harvest the fields, right? But if AI and robotics can do the work, wealth can grow without needing human labor at all, fundamentally altering the historical dynamic. And looking even further ahead, breakthroughs in genetic engineering could create a world where the elites aren't just financially wealthier, but actually possess fundamentally different physical and cognitive advantages. Which leaves us with this final, profound question to ponder today. Can modern humanity find a peaceful way to manage inequality, or are we destined to repeat the violent cycles of the past? The historical data strongly suggests that peaceful reform is an incredibly steep uphill battle. But recognizing the patterns of our deep past is the very first step toward consciously changing our future. Thank you for diving into the objective, fascinating history of human civilization with us on this Explainer.